locked in an asylum cellar to rot. A Lakota chief broke the door down and gave her freedom. The chain on that door was the kind they use for draft horses. 3 links thick, good iron, and the lock was a Scandinavian thing, heavy as a boot. I know because I held it in my hand for a long moment before I snapped it. Not with bolt cutters. I didn't have bolt cutters. I had a length of iron bar I'd pulled out of the fence line 2 miles back, and I had time, and I had something that had been burning in my chest since the old doctor in Caldwell told me where they'd taken her. That was in the early part of October. The cottonwoods had gone yellow, and the mornings were cold enough to see your breath. I'd ridden 3 days on a horse that wasn't mine. I'd borrowed him from my cousin Running Elk, and I owed Running Elk a better horse than the one I'd borrowed, and I came into Caldwell with dust in my collar and dried blood on my left forearm where a branch had cut me coming through the draw. I wasn't in a mood to be patient with anyone. I wasn't in a mood for much. The doctor's name was Fenwick, a small man, dry as chalk, with eyes that moved around a room like he was always counting exits. He knew who I was before I said my name. That happens. I have been known in that part of Kansas since before most of the white men there were born, and the ones who weren't alive yet to know me personally had fathers who did. This is not boasting. It is just a fact of a long life lived in one place. He told me they'd taken Margaret 2 weeks prior. He said it quietly, and I noticed he said it quietly. He said it the way a man says a thing he knows is wrong but has decided to accept because the wrong is not being done to him. She'd been brought before the county board on the petition of her brother-in-law, a man named Aldous Fenn who wanted the land she'd inherited from her late husband and had no other legal way to take it. The board had 3 men on it. 2 of them owed Aldous Fenn money. The third was Aldous Fenn's wife's uncle. The doctor had testified that Margaret was of sound mind. They dismissed his testimony. They'd sent her to the Territorial Asylum at Hatchfield, which was 60 miles east, and which the doctor said with his dry chalk voice was not a place he would send an animal. He said all of this to the wall behind my left shoulder. I asked him why he hadn't stopped it. He said he was one man. I told him one man was enough if the one man was willing to act like one. Then I left. I don't tell that part of it to make myself sound noble. I tell it because it's what happened and because I have found in my life that the truth of a thing is usually simpler than people want it to be. A woman was put somewhere she shouldn't be put. She had done nothing wrong. I knew her. That was enough. Let me tell you how I knew her. Her name was Margaret Ashford, widow of Thomas Ashford, who had come out of Ohio with a surveyor's kit and a head full of plans, and had homesteaded a stretch of ground in the Cimarron Breaks that most men had said was worth nothing. Thomas had died 3 years before, not violently, just a fever that went wrong, and Margaret had kept the claim working. She'd hired 2 hands, one of them a half-blood Cheyenne named Spotted Horse who had worked for her husband and who was honest, and she'd run cattle and kept a garden and sold eggs to the settlement at Cedar Point. She was not a rich woman, but she was not a poor one either, and the land she held had turned out to sit over a decent aquifer that several men with money had become interested in. I had met her 4 years before Thomas died, when I had ridden down to the Breaks to settle a dispute about a fence line that her cattle and my cousin's cattle shared. The fence line dispute turned out to be my cousin's fault entirely, which I told Thomas Ashford plainly, and which Margaret Ashford seemed to appreciate. We talked for perhaps an hour at the gate of their yard, the 3 of us, and I found her to be a woman who listened before she spoke, and who said what she meant without ornament. Thomas Ashford was a decent man, and he had a decent wife. I went back to my people and did not see her again for over a year. But I came to know her, in the way you come to know someone at a distance. Cedar Point was in the range of my people's movement, and we passed through it several times a year, and I heard things. I heard that when the drought came she had watered her neighbor Hennessy's cattle alongside her own because his well had gone dry, and he was too proud to ask. I heard that when the Watkins boy had broken his arm badly, both bones in the forearm, and his father was away. She had set it herself and splinted it with wood from a chair, and he'd kept the arm. I heard that when a group of men from the settlement came to speak to her about letting them run her off the land quietly, she had met them on her porch with a rifle across her arms and told them she would be happy to have a conversation, but they'd need to turn their horses around first because she didn't negotiate with men who rode up to her house uninvited. I heard that and I turned it over in my mind and I thought, that is a woman who knows what she is. Thomas died. I rode down to say a word over the grave, which is a courtesy that crosses many lines if the man on the other side of those lines has the sense to see it. She thanked me. She did not cry in front of me, which is not a thing I judge. Some people cry and some don't, and neither means more grief than the other. But she gripped my hand at the gate the way you grip the hand of someone you intend to see again, not the polite, light grip of a social gesture. She gripped my hand and looked at me straight. I thought about that grip on the 3-day ride to Hatchfield. The Territorial Asylum was a building that had been built to be a mill, and then abandoned, and then converted by men who had more interest in the conversion fees than in what the conversion produced. Stone walls, low ceilings, 2 stories plus a cellar, set back from the road in a stand of dead elms. The elms were dead because the ground around the building had been cleared of topsoil to fill in a low spot in the road, and whoever had done the clearing hadn't understood that elms need topsoil. The trees stood there white and stripped, and the building sat behind them, and the whole thing looked like something that had decided to be ugly and had committed to it. There was a man at the gate, not an armed man, just a man with a ledger who wanted to know my business. I told him I was here to see the superintendent. He said the superintendent didn't receive visitors without an appointment. I told him the superintendent would receive me. There is a particular way I have of saying a thing like that. I don't raise my voice. I don't change my expression. But there is something in the way I hold myself when I say it. My father's people called it the chief standing, and it has a way of making men with ledgers rethink their positions. The man at the gate rethought his. He let me through. The superintendent was a man named Graber, heavyset, with a red face and small ears and the hands of a man who had once done hard physical work, but had stopped about 15 years ago and hadn't found anything else useful to do with them since. He had an office on the 2nd floor that smelled of pipe tobacco and something underneath the pipe tobacco that I didn't want to identify. He was pleasant with me at first, the way a man is pleasant when he isn't sure how much trouble you can make and is calculating. I told him I was here about Margaret Ashford. He told me she was a patient in their care, and that her care was not available for public discussion. I asked him what care meant in this place. He told me it was a complex field, and that laymen often misunderstood it. I told him I was not a layman. I told him I was Iron Hawk, chief of the Lower Oglala Band, and that I had ridden 3 days on a borrowed horse to have this conversation, and that I would like him to take me to where Margaret Ashford was being held right now. Not in an hour, not after he'd sent a man to warn the attendants, but right now, this minute, while I was still in a cooperative mood. He told me he couldn't do that without proper authorization. I stood up. I am not a small man. I am 6 feet and 2 inches and my shoulders are broad, and I was 53 years old at the time of this story, which is old enough to have gathered some weight without losing any of the width that comes with it. I put my hat on my head and I looked at Graber for a moment, and then I walked past him out of the office and down the stairs. He called after me. I didn't stop. I found the cellar door in the back of the building, past a kitchen that smelled of boiled grain and unwashed tin. The door was iron-banded oak, and the chain I described at the beginning was wrapped twice through the handle and the hasp. I stood there and I looked at it. There were sounds from below, not screaming, not the sounds of violence, just sounds, the particular sounds of people being in a place that had forgotten they existed. I went back to the fence line where I'd tied my horse, and I pulled the iron bar out of my saddle roll. Graber was in the yard by then, with two attendants who were younger and whiter than he was. One of them had a hickory club. I walked back to the cellar door with the iron bar in my hand. Graber told me to stop. He told me I had no legal authority. He told me the law was on his side. I said, the law that put an innocent woman in a cellar, that law. He said she was committed by the county board. I said I know she was. Two of those board members owe money to her brother-in-law. That is not a proceeding. That is a transaction. He said, you can't prove that. I said, I don't have to prove it today. Today I am just here to get this woman out of this building. What happens after that is between you and the courts, and I have very good reason to believe the courts will be interested. He told his men to stop me. The man with the hickory club came at me from the left. I stepped to the outside of his swing, which he had telegraphed badly, and I put my left forearm across his chest hard enough to sit him down, and I took the club away from him while he was sitting down because he was still holding it. I put the club against the wall. I didn't hit him with it. I want to be clear about that. I am not in the habit of using violence beyond what a situation requires. This situation didn't require it. The other man had stopped. Graber had stopped. I turned back to the cellar door and I worked the iron bar through the chain, and I used the door handle as a lever point, and I put my weight against the bar. The chain held for a moment, and then the hasp pulled out of the wood. Good iron chain, poor wood. The door swung open. The stairs went down into darkness. I went down them. I want to tell you what it was like down there, but I have found in the years since that I am not able to do it without feeling again what I felt then, and feeling it is not something I particularly want to do in the middle of telling a story. So I will say only this. There were 12 people in that cellar, and the conditions were such that no person who had put another person in those conditions should be able to sleep easily. I will say that and leave the rest of it. She was in the far corner. I recognized her shape before my eyes had adjusted fully to the dark, the set of her shoulders, the way she held her head up. She had been there 2 weeks and she was holding her head up. That told me everything I needed to know about whether they'd broken her. I said her name. She said mine. She stood up. She was thinner than she should have been. There was something wrong with her lip, a cut that had mostly healed but shouldn't have been there. She was wearing the same dress she'd been brought in with, which was a pale blue dress with small white buttons, and it was gray now with the cellar's dirt. She looked at me with those straight eyes she had, the same eyes she'd looked at me with at her husband's grave, at her gate the first time we met. She said, I knew someone would come. I said, I'm sorry it took as long as it did. She said, you're here. I put my hand on her arm just to check if she was steady on her feet, and she put her hand over mine and held it there for a moment. Her hand was cold. The cellar was cold. She didn't lean on me, but she didn't let go either, and we stood there for just a moment in that dark, and then she said, all right, let's go. We went up the stairs. Graber was waiting at the top. He'd gotten some courage back from somewhere, or he'd talked himself into believing he needed it, and he stepped in front of the door and told me that I was committing a criminal act, that he would have me arrested, that Margaret Ashford was a ward of the territory and could not leave without a legal order. Margaret stepped past me. She said, Mr. Graber. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. I have seen that shift in men's faces before. It is the shift that happens when a man who has had power over someone is suddenly looking at that person in daylight, on equal terms, and is realizing for the first time that the power was borrowed. She said, I will be before a judge within the week. So will you. I would use the time between now and then wisely. She walked past him through the door. I followed her. Graber didn't stop us. He didn't call for anyone. I heard him behind us, just standing there. We rode out together, Margaret on Graber's own horse, which I had decided he owed her. I'll explain that logic another time. We rode out through the dead elms and onto the road, and we didn't look back. After perhaps a mile, she said, "How did you know?" I told her about the doctor in Caldwell. I told her what he'd said about the board and Aldous Fenn. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Aldous always had a talent for transactions." I said, "He'll have a talent for making explanations soon enough." She looked over at me. The afternoon light was coming in from the west, and it caught the side of her face, and she looked like herself. That is the only way I know to say it. She looked like the woman who had met men on her porch with a rifle and told them to turn their horses around, and also like the woman who had set a boy's broken arm, and also like the woman who had gripped my hand at a gate and meant it. She said, "Why did you come? You didn't have to." I thought about that. I said, "You're a neighbor. And you're good people, and good people shouldn't be put in cellars." She said, "That's a short answer to a long ride." I said, "Most true things are short." She looked at me a moment longer than the conversation required. Then she turned back to the road and we rode. I need to tell you about the week that followed, because it matters, and because it is the part of this story that I return to most often in the way a man returns to a thing he didn't fully understand when it happened, but understands better now. We rode to Cedar Point, which was 9 miles from Hatchfield. I had a man there, a trader named Hector Voss, Comanche Mexican, who had a storehouse and a room above it and who owed me a favor. We put Margaret in the room above the storehouse, and I slept outside it on the landing with my rifle across my knees, which is something I had not done for a woman since my wife died 6 years before, and which felt both strange and entirely natural. Aldous Fenn came the second morning. He brought 2 men with him, hired men by the look of them, and a paper he said was a legal order. I met him in the street in front of Hector's store. He was smaller than I expected. Men who do their damage with papers and county boards are often smaller than you expect. He had a neat beard and a gray coat, and the paper in his hand, and the 2 hired men behind him, and he looked at me with the particular expression of a man who cannot decide if he is frightened or outraged, and has settled on both. He said, "I have a legal order for the return of Margaret Ashford to the custody of the Territorial Asylum at Hatchfield." I said, "Let me see that paper." He handed it over. I read it. I handed it back. I said, "This is signed by Judge Carmichael." He said, "That's right." I said, "Judge Carmichael is in Dodge City." He said, "Judges can sign orders in Dodge City." I said, "Judge Carmichael died in August. I know this because I attended his burial. He was a man I respected, and I paid my respects. The man whose name is on this paper has been in the ground for 6 weeks. Aldous Fenn looked at the paper. I said, "So what you have is a document signed by a dead man's name. That is not a legal order. That is a forgery." And a forgery, in a proceeding that has already involved the wrongful commitment of a woman to an asylum, is the kind of thing that federal judges are interested in. Do you understand what I'm saying? He said nothing for a moment. One of the hired men behind him shifted his weight. I looked at him. He stopped shifting. Fenn said, "You have no standing to involve yourself in this matter." I said, "You're right that I have no legal standing. You're wrong that I have no standing. I have been known in this territory since before it was a territory, and I have ridden through the breaks and the flats and the river country between the Cimarron and the Republican Fork for 50 years, and every man who does business in this part of the world knows my word. You put an innocent woman in a cellar with a forged paper and a corrupted board. My word about that is going to travel farther and faster than your legal standing." He said, "That sounds like a threat." I said, "It's a fact. Like I said, true things are short." He left. He left the paper behind, which I thought was either carelessness or evidence that he was more frightened than he looked. I kept it. Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs while I was still watching the street. I didn't turn around, but I heard her step on the landing, and then the door of the store below open. She came and stood beside me. She said, "Was any of that true, about the judge?" I said every word of it. I was surprised he didn't know. He should have done better research. She said, "What did you mean about your word traveling?" I said, "I mean what I said. I have people from here to the Platte. Aldous Fenn is going to find it very difficult to do business in this territory." She was quiet. Then she said, "What do you want for all of this?" I looked at her. I said, "Margaret, I got you out of a cellar. I'm not charging you for it." She said, "I know you're not charging me. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking what you want." I thought about that. The cottonwoods were still yellow on the bank of the creek south of town. The morning light came down the street flat and clean. Hector's mule was at the rail, head down, deciding whether to be interested in a piece of straw near its left hoof. I said, "I want to ride back out to the breaks with you and see that your claim is in order. I want to see that Spotted Horse is still there and that the cattle are all right. After that, I don't know." She looked at me, the straight-eyed look. She said, "That's not a short answer." I said, No, it wasn't. That was something between us after that. I'm not sure what the name for it is in English. In Lakota, we have a word for the thing that two people who respect each other deeply become, if they are careful with each other and honest about what is between them. It is not the same as love, or rather it is love but a specific kind, the kind that has looked at all the other kinds and decided to be something more durable. We went back to the breaks. Spotted Horse was there. The cattle were all right. The cabin was as she'd left it, except Aldous Fenn had sent a man through who had broken a window and gone through her papers, and she spent an afternoon in the kind of cold rage that is more frightening than the shouting kind, sorting through what had been disturbed, finding what was missing, making a list in a tight small hand. I fixed the window. It took me most of the afternoon because I had to ride to Cedar Point for glass. But I came back and I fixed it, and she came out at dusk and looked at the new glass and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "My husband bought that glass in Abilene. He drove it home in the wagon with rags packed around it 26 miles, and it didn't break once." I said, "This glass is from Hector's store. It isn't as old. But it'll keep the wind out." She said, "Yes, it will." She looked at me then with the last of the day's light on her face, and I want to tell you what that look was. I know what it was. It was the look of a woman who has been through something that would have finished most people, and has come out the other side of it with her spine intact, and who is standing in the doorway of her own home on her own land at dusk with a man she trusts, and who knows the value of what that is. I stayed that night. I slept in the barn, which was where the propriety of the situation put me, and which was fine because the barn was dry and the horse-running elk had lent me was in there, and we were both comfortable. In the morning she made coffee and brought a cup out to the barn and set it on the fence post near the door without saying anything about it, which is not a small thing. That is a woman who knows how to say something without saying it. We talked over coffee about the legal situation. I had the forged paper. I knew a lawyer in Wichita, a man named Beaumont Slade, who was one of the best I'd ever seen work a courtroom, and who had a particular interest in cases involving property rights and fraudulent commitment proceedings, because his own mother had been committed fraudulently 20 years before, in Georgia, and he'd spent the better part of his working life making that kind of thing costly for the people who tried it. I told Margaret about Beaumont Slade. She said, "Can he be trusted?" I said, "I have seen him work, yes." She said, "Will you come to Wichita?" I said, "I'll come to Wichita." We rode to Wichita. That is a long ride, and it took us 5 days, and I will tell you that 5 days on the trail with a person tells you more about them than 5 years of being neighbors. Margaret Ashford was good on a horse, better than good, the kind of rider who understands that a horse has its own opinion about the ground and should be consulted rather than overridden. She was a light camp keeper, meaning she didn't fuss, Meaning when we camped she did what needed doing and no more and didn't apologize for the quality of the coffee. She was not a talker in the morning, which suited me. She was more of a talker in the evening after supper when the fire was low, and she talked about things that mattered to her, her land, her cattle, what she meant to do with the place when she had the legal clouds cleared. She talked about Thomas sometimes briefly, without the particular weight that grief sometimes puts on a dead person's name. She had loved him and he was gone and she had kept going. That was the shape of it. She asked me questions, real questions, not social ones. She asked me about the Oglala, about the politics of the territory, about what I thought was coming for the next 10 years. She asked me about my wife. I told her about Soft Rain, her name, what kind of woman she was, how she had died, which was not violently but of a lung sickness that took 6 months to take her. Margaret listened without the particular expression of pity that white people sometimes put on when they are listening to grief, and which I have always found more uncomfortable than helpful. She just listened. On the 4th night, camped near the Nineska, she said, "Do you have children?" I said 3 sons, 2 living, 1 died at the Powder River. She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "It was 17 years ago." She said, "And you think time makes it smaller?" I said, "I think time makes it different, not smaller." She said, "Yes, that's right." We sat for a while with the fire. Then she said, "I want you to know something." I waited. She said, "When I was in that place in Hatchfield, I had enough time to think, too much time, and the thing I thought about after a while wasn't the land or the legal situation or what Aldous was doing to my claim. It was whether anyone was going to come. That was the thing. Not the conditions, not what they were doing to me. Just, is there someone who will come?" I said nothing. She said, "And I thought of you, specifically you. I don't know why exactly. I just thought if anyone comes it will be Iron Hawk, because you are the kind of man who does." The fire settled. I said I should have come sooner. She said, "You came when you could, you came." She looked at me across the fire. Not the way a woman looks at a man when she wants something from him, or when she is performing something for an audience. The way a woman looks at a man she knows and values and trusts and has decided to say so plainly. No theater in it, just the fact of it. I held that look. I said, "I'm glad I came." She said, "So am I." That was all we said about it that night. We got to Wichita the following afternoon, and I took her to Beaumont Slade's office on Kisham Street, which was above a harness shop and smelled accordingly. Beaumont Slade was 55 that year, a thin, quick man with white hair and the kind of face that looked ordinary until he was in front of a judge, at which point it became a different kind of face entirely, precise and cold and absolutely certain. He looked at the forged paper for 30 seconds and then he looked at me and said, "Where did you get this?" I told him. He said, "Do you understand what this is?" I said, "Tell me." He said, "This isn't just a forgery. This is a forgery in a proceeding that involved an improper commitment, which means the men who signed the commitment are also exposed, which means the county board is exposed, which means 3 people at minimum are going to want this to go away very quietly and quickly." Margaret said, "I don't want it to go away quietly." Beaumont looked at her, then he looked at me, then he looked back at her. He said, "All right, then we don't make it go away quietly." It took 4 months. Beaumont Slade was a man who understood that the law moves at the speed of patience, and patience was something I had learned from a life lived in country that required it. Margaret went back to the breaks with Spotted Horse and ran her cattle and fixed her fence lines and waited. I went back to my people and did the work that my people required of me, which was considerable, and came through the breaks twice in those 4 months to see how she was. Both times she met me at the gate the way she had always met me, straight, without fuss, with coffee on the stove. Both times we talked into the evening. Both times I stayed in the barn. Both times she brought coffee to the fence post in the morning without comment. The third time I came through the break she had news. Beaumont had filed in federal court. Aldous Fenn had hired a lawyer from Kansas City who had reportedly gone pale when he saw the forged signature. The two board members who owed Fenn money had quietly retained their own lawyers, separately, which Beaumont said was the best news possible because it meant they were preparing to cooperate. She told me all of this at the kitchen table with a lamp between us and a pot of beans on the stove, and when she was done, she sat back in her chair and she looked at me and she said, "It's going to be all right." I said, "Yes, it is." She said, "Because of you." I said, "Because of Beaumont Slade and 4 months of federal procedure." She said, "You know what I mean." I looked at her. I said, "Yes. I know what you mean." There was a moment then. One of those moments that is just the two people in it and the lamp and the sound of the beans and the wind outside, and nothing more needed to be said and nothing was. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, not the grip she'd given me at her husband's grave, not the grip of someone who intends to see you again. A different thing. Her hand just resting on mine, warm and certain. I turned my hand over under hers. We sat like that for a while. The beans were fine. The coffee was better. Outside, the wind came down from the north with the first real promise of winter in it, and the fire in the stove worked to hold it off, and it was warm at that table. The trial, when it came, was not dramatic in the way that trials in stories tend to be. It was methodical. Beaumont Slade was methodical. He put the forged paper in front of the judge with the explanation of why it was a forgery and what that meant in the context of the commitment proceeding. And then he sat down, and the judge looked at the paper, and then the judge looked at Aldous Fenn's lawyer, and the lawyer said several things that were the legal equivalent of a man trying to explain why the stove is on fire. And then the judge said several things in return that were the legal equivalent of someone handing the man a bucket. Aldous Fenn settled. His two board members settled separately, which meant their settlements came out of their own pockets, which meant they were angry at Aldous Fenn, which meant they were inclined to say things in depositions that were useful to Margaret's case. The final judgment restored her title to the land in full, awarded damages that would have made Thomas Ashford's eyes go wide, and referred the matter of the forged signature to the state's attorney. I was not in the courtroom for most of it. I had my own people's concerns, and I couldn't spend 4 months in Wichita. But I was there for the judgment, standing at the back of the room, and I watched Margaret receive it, sitting at the table next to Beaumont with her straight back and her straight eyes, and I thought about her in that cellar saying, "I knew someone would come." And I thought, well, someone came. She came to the back of the room after and she stood in front of me and she said, "Well, that's done." I said, "It's done." She said, "What now?" I looked at her. The courtroom was emptying around us, men with papers and coats and various concerns moving past. She didn't look at any of them. She was looking at me. I said, "I have a proposal." She waited. I said, "I have a half-section of good bottomland east of my people's winter ground, along the Niobrara Fork. Good water, good grass, sheltered by the bluffs on the north. I have been thinking it would carry cattle." She said, "The Niobrara Fork is a long way from the Cimarron Breaks." I said, "Yes, it is." She said nothing. I said, "I am 53 years old. I have been a chief and a warrior and a trader and a widower, and I have ridden more miles in this territory than most men alive. I am not a man who makes proposals he hasn't thought through." She said, "I know you're not." I said, "I am proposing that you consider. That's all, consider." She looked at me for a long moment. The courtroom was nearly empty now. The afternoon light came in the high windows and lay on the floor between us. She said, "What would it take to get good cattle up to the Niobrara Fork?" I said, "A crew of 5, maybe 6. 3 weeks of careful driving if the weather holds." She said, "Spotted Horse is a good drover." I said, "I know his work." She said, the Cimarron land is paid for. I don't need to sell it right away. I said no. She said I could lease it to Hennessy. He needs good grass. I said Hennessy would take care of it. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, all right, Iron Hawk, I'll consider it. She put out her hand. I took it. Not the grip at the gate. Not the hand over mine at the table. A handshake, firm and level, which is what two people who know each other as well as we knew each other do when they have just agreed on something important. Then she smiled. She had a particular smile, not wide, not performative, just a real one, which is a different and better thing. She said, you know, when they put me in that cellar, I thought a lot of things, but I'll tell you the truth. What I thought was, there is a man in this world who rides 3 days on a borrowed horse for the right reason. If that man comes through that door, I will be all right. I said I rode 4 days. The borrowed horse was slow. She laughed, a real laugh, quick and surprised. I held her hand a moment, longer than a handshake requires. Then we walked out of the courthouse together into the Wichita afternoon, and the sky over the Kansas plain was the particular gray-blue of late autumn, and the air smelled of dust and coal smoke from the rail yards, and we walked out into it side by side. I don't have a neater ending for you than that. Life doesn't work that way. What I can tell you is that the following spring there were Ashford cattle on the Niobrara bottomland, driven up by Spotted Horse and a crew of 5. And there was a woman with a straight back living in a house I had helped build on the bluff above the river bend. And in the evenings, there was a lamp in the window that I could see from the ridge above the camp. And it was there when I went up, and it was there when I came down. That's enough. That has always been enough.